Welcome to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast, where non-diet nutrition, weight-inclusive care, and integrative health collide. We're your hosts, Dana Montes and Christina Hoyt, licensed integrative clinical nutritionists and body image coaches.
And we believe you deserve to have a joyful relationship with food in your body, even if you have a chronic health condition or symptoms that just won't quit. On this show, together and with our guests, we're bringing the real talk, no BS vibe with tangible tools to help you pursue health and wellness without obsession or restriction.
Remember our disclaimer, this podcast is meant for general information purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Big thanks to Spark Bites for sponsoring today's episode. Find out more about this great prebiotic snack at sparkbites.net. On today's episode, Christina interviews Nicola Haggett for an entirely body image focused episode. Nicola is a body liberationist, coach, and mentor whose work focuses on supporting folks to move beyond body positivity to unlearn body shame, reconnect to their body, and intentionally practice their way towards a world where each of us has more safety, compassion, and joy in our bodies. They discuss how grief plays an integral role of the body liberation practice, as well as practical tools to help disrupt body shame and rewrite body stories to help us move forward in our own body image journeys.
So Nicola, we're so happy to have you on today and talk about rewriting body stories. And I think when Dana is unfortunately not on today, but when we were thinking about this interview and kind of going into it and reading about you more and trying to get to know you better before we started chatting, we came across something on your about page that really we were like, oh, this is what an amazingly powerful thing to say. And we really wanted you to expand on it, where in your about page, you said, my lived experiences are just as valuable as my credentials. And I really, really loved that. And I would love for you to tell us more about how your lived experiences are so valuable in helping people disrupt body shame.
That's a really surprising place to start. Actually, I can feel myself being surprised because it's so refreshing to have, a practitioner to name the validity of lived experiences. It doesn't happen often enough. So I guess what I mean by that, so I'm a fat person. I use that word as a neutral descriptor for my body, which hasn't always been the case, but it feels really supportive now. I'm also multiply neurodivergent. I'm chronically ill. And it's been my experience that, from different positions in each of those experiences, somehow I'm invalidated from being an expert in my own experiences. There's something already about the experience being a fat person that you so often meet, people who are experts in your experience who have never been fat or who aren't fat. There's so often the experience that you can't be trusted in your own experience, that you're non-compliant, through experiences of healthcare professionals, that really your body is a reflection of your lack of willpower. That really it's just simple and you just need to be told what to do. And you sort of get all these layers of experience. I think the other piece of it is, even in areas like weight stigma, so often that research is done sort of about and on fat people rather than centering the experiences of fat people. And the same goes for neurodivergent folks, for just disabled folks. So I think really I'm naming explicitly here that I bring my lived experience to my work, not in a way to center myself or my story, but just to kind of reorganize the idea that the only kind of expertise that's valid is that with sort of, through the research or for the literature or for the evidence base or from the experts. Yeah.
No, I think that's beautiful, and I think it also kind of lends itself to a broader conversation of self-disclosure when working as a professional. I think too. I think sometimes self-disclosure is considered to be, not something that you're supposed to share in and not supposed to do always. And I think when you're talking about conversations like that are so incredibly vulnerable and so incredibly personal, but also um but also what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of also cultural. It's almost impossible to really be able to dig into the trenches of it if there isn't some layer of self-disclosure. I mean, I can't imagine how it wouldn't be valuable to anybody listening or working with someone on body shame and not being able to say, hey, I've been there too. And I've been able to weave my way through these struggles that I've had that are big T trauma and little T trauma throughout my entire life, and been able to work through the other end of it. To me, that almost feels even more powerful to hear than someone saying like, oh yeah, I have this degree and this, that, and the other thing. Not that that's not valuable in and of itself, right? And that says something too, but for someone to come to me and say, have you actually done this before? Like, is this all theoretical, or is there actual things that I can work through in order to get to this other place of more acceptance of myself and everything? And to me, I find that to be invaluable, like just so unbelievably important. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about how you work with people to disrupt their body shame.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree on the piece about sort of sensitively done and also explicitly named self-disclosure and lived experience is a really important work of peer support and, I guess lineages of support outside of dominant systems, where people don't get are kind of left out of what's offered. Yeah, so that's kind of part of what I'm drawing on there. So when I work with folks, I am drawing on a couple of different bodies of work. So there is a piece of it that is peer support. So I'm really naming up front that this isn't about my story or my lived experiences, but hey, I'm practicing alongside you here. This is not a place that I've arrived at. I don't think it's possible to arrive at a place of body liberation in this culture that we live in. So here I am practicing too, and I have some deeper roots in some of these places, and also I don't know what your experiences are. You're going to have some deeper roots. So there's a piece of it which is collaborative, it's co-created, it's relational work. I'm not here as an expert. I'm really here to create space for people to start to name their own experiences, their own body stories, to start to situate themselves in a context which allows space for them to locate the problem outside of themselves and outside of their body, to kind of notice where we go to fixing. So, I'm sure you experience this, and I experience it often when people do come to work with me, because I have lived experience, there's something we need to name up front, in that I don't have the plan. I don't have the answer. I wish I could have the 8-step blueprint. But I don't have that. And that's really uncomfortable right up front. So like part of what I'm doing right in the beginning when I work with someone is kind of, we're situating ourselves in context. Be in a context, them in the context of their life, their experiences, what's come between them and being at home in their body when they first learned that their body was a problem. And really kind of normalizing like where they're at, the wisdom of where they're at, that it makes sense where they've struggled, that it makes sense to also feel a bit wobbly about embarking on this journey. And really, I'm led by them. I'm led by what's showing up in the session as a place to kind of hop off from. But it's a really non-linear process. It's a really iterative process. And so right in the beginning, we're kind of spending a lot of time naming that and circling back and grieving that there's not a plan, grieving that there's not some kind of answer, that the fixing doesn't work. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, because it is a really kind of individualized process, but that's some of what comes up for me.
No, absolutely. I think one of the things that I think is interesting too is about how you situate yourself. And that's something that you mentioned too, like you're situating yourself in your world and in the context for how you maybe feel about your body, or what you've been told you should feel about your body that you've then internalized and taken on as your own, right? Because I think about my own child, and I know you have children too. My daughter is 5 years old, and I've never heard her talk about her body in any way that was in any way kind of negative, and which is amazing. And you always kind of think like, when does this then happen? And I think kind of creating a timeline for yourself of writing down, like, when was the first time that I acknowledged this, or this was told to me that something was wrong or should be changed or could be different. When did this happen? And then kind of creating this whole timeline for yourself of like, how did I get here? Like, how did this all happen? And I think sometimes, I know for me personally, and also when I work with clients of mine, that's always kind of in its own way kind of liberating to see like, oh no, this happened to me in a lot of ways too. And I think that although that is difficult, right, and awful to know that this happened to you, but I think that there comes some acknowledgement in that of saying like, oh no, there isn't something inherently wrong with me. This happened to me. And I think that's like the beginning of where this grief and healing can kind of come together in a way. And one of the things that you talked about on Instagram was, I'd love for you to talk about the different types of grief that are happening. And you mentioned grief around that there isn't a system to get you out of this. And then also too, there's another type of grief that I feel like a lot of times people aren't talking about. And I think you mentioned it really beautifully about how you're grieving this thin ideal and how it's an ambiguous loss, and it feels kind of strange. And like, you don't really know what you're grieving, except that you've been told to hold on to this picture of yourself of what could be. And I'd love for you to talk more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, oftentimes I think body grief is kind of where we start in this work, and it's there continuously. And sometimes when we talk about grief, it kind of can initially, we can feel like, oh, we're grieving weight loss, or we're grieving, weight gain, and it kind of stops there. And yes, that's part of it, because with that comes access to privilege, with that comes validation, with that comes proximity to health. I'm using health in kind of scare quotes there. And so when I talk about grief with folks, we're really spending some time trying to get underneath it, like and what else, and where are we locating the problem? So we're validating that that when we're performing or attempting weight loss, when we're sort of in the act of engaging with the thin ideal, that gets us somewhere. That maybe promises relief from stigma, that maybe promises closer proximity to gender norms for some of us. It might be safer for us. Well, it certainly is safer for us a lot of the times in this community. It might get us access to healthcare procedures. So really validating that it's not this frivolous pursuit, that it really makes a lot of sense, that it's so hard to get rid of that. Like even the fantasy of imagining that we might be, successful in our weight loss attempts in the future, even that gives some soothing, some relief. So kind of naming that. And then the second part of it for me, is like a lot of the models for grief that we use, like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model, they're really helpful, but often for me and for folks I work with, so for those who don't know that model, it's kind of a model for kind of, I guess, the stages of grief. And it's not supposed to be a linear model, but it also is kind of a model that applies more when we have a grief that can kind of be resolved in some way a bit more. And it can feel a bit invalidating for folks who have chronic illness, disability, for fat folks who really name how ambiguous it feels, this loss. And what I mean by that is that there are times when we can feel really sort of rooted in the grief, that yes, we're letting go of this, I'm grieving, I can't do this anymore, and then there are times we bump up against in culture, like, weight loss drugs. We're constantly told, what about weight loss surgery? We're constantly coming up against the promise of the latest, plan. And in that, there are many moments of feeling like, oh, maybe this problem, again, in inverted commas, of my weight, of my fatness, could be solved, and so we get swept up in that fantasy. And so often with folks that I work with, and in my own experience, that we get pulled off into the fantasy again much more easily, because we can't 100% resolve it. And so there's like a model for that, that Dr. Pauline Boss developed, called ambiguous loss. And so I use that with folks, in fact, by naming the ambiguity, naming that perhaps we can't ever resolve this. Then now what, And like some of what we'll do is like look at the attachment to the fantasy, and how do we kind of interrupt that attachment a little bit? How do we find new meaning in our experiences? How do we find community? How can we keep naming, oh yeah, here I am again. It's, I'm being swept up in this fantasy. And it does kind of, the pull lessens with time, but it doesn't really fully go away. And I think just normalizing that for people can be really helpful, because often you can feel like you're doing it wrong if you haven't fully reached a point of kind of acceptance as sort of the end point in a lot of these models.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think also too, if your main experience is looking on Instagram, a lot of times Instagram is polarizing, right? There's usually one side or the other. It doesn't really lend itself to having ambiguity and having it be gray. And it doesn't really share that a lot of times. So I think it can make people feel sometimes like they're failing at something, and then that leads to even more, right? And it's hard to then not go back to the coping and comfort that you can get from engaging in the fantasy. Like, well, maybe I can't ever get to this place either, because I'm so, for various reasons, who knows, all the different things too, because you are routinely on a daily, moment to moment basis. The Dr. Lindsay and Lexi Kite talk about in their book about waves of body disruption. And I feel like that happens a lot, right? On a day-to-day basis, you get hit with a body image disruption, like something happens and then all of a sudden you're like going right back into this body shame all over again. And to me, it's not so much about becoming to this place where it's like quote unquote healed and you don't feel those anymore. To me, it's more of, how long do I stay there? Like, how long do I attach to this disruption and let it pull me into all of the different pieces, and more about my resilience to them long term, and being able to kind of name them and being able to say, hey, this is happening right now. I'm attaching to this thin ideal, or this idea that I had of what things could look like. What's happening inside? How can we move forward? And how can I like you said, attach to it a little bit differently, or acknowledge that I'm attaching to it. And I think that makes it a little bit more accessible for people to be able to really work through, and being able to acknowledge that this is happening, and that without it feeling like it's either one side of the coin or the other. It's either I'm in it or I'm over it. And I think a lot of the information online is like, oh, you're over it. Like that's the only way to get through it, is to be over it. And I don't think that's realistic.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. And I know that in body trust, which is one of the modalities that I'm trained in, we talk about the healing being in the return, like you said. Like, it's not really on not getting pulled into the fantasy, or not even getting pulled into, another weight loss attempt. That's not like where we're looking at success or failure. It's kind of like, and those periods of time, what helps us return and what helps us come back. So we're not setting to success as not ever getting pulled off again into the fantasy, but kind of, accepting that that's not going to happen. And I think like the other piece that this really allows for is kind of making space for the complexity for folks, for, super fat and infinite-fat folks, for folks who are, being denied gender affirming surgery, being denied all sorts of access to care, that in those discussions, sometimes, they're choosing to engage, or pursue weight loss surgery, or pursue, weight loss attempts, knowing that it's, but feeling like it's somehow worth it for the reduction in stigma, even if it's for a temporary period of time. And that when we put an intersectional lens on it, that sort of, having this more expansive idea of what we're grieving, and naming multiple layers of it, can kind of, in my experience with the folks I work with, like, leave a bit more space for them to say, yeah, it's not just about size here. It's also about access. It's also about, it's about care, and it's really nuanced. So yeah, I love that you named it. It's, that Instagram doesn't allow for that in a lot of ways.
No, and I mean, honestly, I think that's by design, right? I think if people talked about how you might not ever really get through this, they might be less inclined to go down the road, right? Like, because everyone's looking for relief. You're looking for relief, and of course you are, right? I mean, how could you not be when you're bombarded constantly with being told that there's something inherently wrong with your body and it needs to change? How could you not be? That would be really scary, to go down a road and say, okay, this is going to be gray for the rest of my life. And when there is this sense of comfort that we get from this ideal that maybe someday things could be different, and I wouldn't have to deal with this medical trauma, I wouldn't have to deal with societal trauma, or within my own family system, things being said to me, and I could go about my life feeling a little bit different, right? Like, that makes sense to me, that it would be really hard to go down that road. And so I understand why there are people out there who are saying you can be liberated from this, and like, you can, you don't have to think about it at all anymore, and you won't have to deal with this anymore. To me, that also feels like a really empowering place to start. And then realizing as you go through it, okay, this is going to be a lot more messy than it actually seems like it's going to be.
Yeah, and I think that's why body stories are so important, and why really making space for, like, what has the fantasy promised? What has weight loss attempts actually given us? So naming, it gave me some validation, or it gave me like a bit of safety. And also, what else was there as well? And how long did that last? Not in a kind of dismissing way, diets don't work, but kind of in a, okay, like, what felt like it worked about them. I got all this validation, and I had a lessening of stigma, and I had proximity to privilege, and I got I was able to move through the world easier for a while, and also you know, what else was there? Maybe there was disordered eating, you know, often, not maybe, you know, maybe there was like, you know, an obsessive thoughts and still a lot of self-doubt, and also the sense that it was not sustainable. And then, you know, just kind of situating ourselves in the full story, like you said, rather than, I think what comes with the fantasy is it tries to flatten our story and just romanticize and idealize this like one period of time when it felt like it worked for like a short period of time. And we're always trying to get back there. Also naming the cost of that, the cost of feeling like we're living in a body that's got to be temporary, means that we can't actually be here in our lives, we can't actually be present. And the grieving is hard, but there's something in being with the grief and making space for it that it kind of connects us also to our aliveness, to what we're yearning for what it is that we're not getting in the culture, you know, and it makes space for us to create different models of possibility, different ways of moving through the world. You know, when folks come to work with me, I named that lived experience is a big part of it. Often, like in some way, they're also looking for like the model of a possibility of something different, even though I'm not providing a map. Our bodies are here in the room with the people that we're working with, even in the Zoom room. And there's something about the way we can hold a space that can sometimes model something different, a different possibility of navigating the world, which does include grief, but which also includes other kinds of freedom and solidarity and alignment with values. So yeah, absolutely. It's hard. It's hard work, but it is so worth it.
And now a quick break for a word from our sponsor, Spark Bites. So you all know that we talk about gut health a lot on this podcast. So today I wanted to talk about a great way to help promote a healthy balance of gut bacteria without the need for supplements. Spark Bites are a great on-the-go, top 8 allergy-free, gluten-free, and plant-based snack packed with prebiotics from gluten-free oats, greens, and seeds. They're also local to me, Dana, and made right in Alexandria, Virginia, which is super cool. So while probiotics are the organisms that we might take in supplemental form or get from fermented foods, yogurt, kombucha, etc., to help support the balance of bacteria in our gut, prebiotics are the food that we can provide to help the beneficial bacteria in our gut microbiome flourish. So prebiotics can help you have more regular and pleasant bowel movements, have less bloating, and promote digestion and nutrient absorption. Spark Bites pack a combination of prebiotics and other nutrient-dense foods and are available in 6 different flavors: cinnamon, which is my favorite, chocolate chip, coffee, red beet, matcha, and turmeric. And if you want to learn more, you can find Spark Bites at www.sparkbites.net, and they can also be found on Amazon. And now back to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine a journey that's not more worth it than going through this process. And you mentioned briefly while you were just a moment ago about meeting your body, and that's something that you wrote about on Instagram too, about the concept of meeting your body. And I think I'd love for you to dive into exactly what you mean by that, meeting your body. I like to think of it like our whole lives we're been told that we should be trying to conquer it. And I like the idea and the concept of trying to meet it instead of trying to beat it. And so I'd love for you to talk about meeting your body and what you mean by that and what kind of support that looks like.
Yeah, there's something you said there, conquering our body. And I think like really where I start is the reason we have to talk about our body in this kind of disembodied way at all is because we live in a culture which really normalizes mind and body being two separate domains, you know. And so often the experience of being in a body in this world, you know, we start off younger kind of without that kind of split really for as long as possible. It's different depending on gender and how you were socialized and race and all of that. But we kind of enter this place of domination almost where we're kind of through all different lenses, like when we go to school, when we go to workplaces, we kind of have to override our body's needs in lots of different ways in order to get through our day. We have to like keep on pushing, we have to, like work longer hours. We can't really, maybe lots of people I work with can't even find time to get a lunch. So we're constantly learning, oh, okay, there's a way in which I've got to take up this project of my body. It has to be more efficient, it has to be thinner. I have to kind of constantly be in the work of improving myself and my body. And when I say meeting my body, what I'm really talking about is noticing, bringing our awareness to all the times that we're conditioned to leave, all the times that we're conditioned to look outside of ourselves, to view our body through this lens of, how do I look? Am I, out of breath? What do people think of me? And not through the place of blaming ourselves for that, but really noticing, like, where did we learn that from? Where did that come from? When did I first learn this? And then from that place, trying to, cultivate a different way of being in relationship with ourselves. So meeting our body is relationship work. It's shifting from domination, mind over matter. I'm going to think my way past my body image problems. I'm going to use affirmations to get myself there. I'm going to do all of this work on and to myself in order to kind of solve this problem. I'm just kind of looking at, like, what would a different kind of relationship look like? Like, how do I practice that? How do I turn towards myself and my body with curiosity, like, what's here? Where did I learn that? Even when we're experiencing shame, like, where's the wisdom in that? Where did I first pick up that practice? And what else might be possible? And guess I'm really looking at domination, moving from domination to partnership, to what would a relationship of partnership be like? And that doesn't mean when we're in partnership that we necessarily always like each other. It doesn't mean we always love each other, but it kind of means, hey, like what's a relationship that I could stand to be in with my body for the rest of my life? What would that look like? What am I committing to here? And I think it's different for everyone what the inroads to that are. For some people, initially when we start meeting our body, it's really from a place of, how can I tolerate this a bit more? How can there be a little less suffering here? And then other people, it's something really different. Other people, it's, I really want to feel more connection with my body, so I don't know if that answers again, but it's really this turning towards, it's relationship work. It's shifting from fixing towards something different. And it's in small steps. There's no kind of grand gestures that are going to get us there, because when we've been conditioned for so long, usually this kind of, Dr. Neva Paran's research on the developmental theory of embodiment, shows that this leaving our body, this rather than meeting, often starts when we're 8, 9, 10. And so when it's been such a long time, it makes sense that meeting ourselves is not quite as straightforward as it might sound initially, that it's going to take some time, that it's going to be cultivated over small actions rather than sort of the grand gestures of diet culture.
It's making me think a little bit, the phrase that's been coming to mind when you mentioned dominate is the idea of, like, fake it till you make it kind of thing. And I feel like that's such a toxic way of looking at stuff, because it continues the idea of dominating it, right? Like, I need to. I need to overcome it and I need to fake it until I get to this other place, when really you're never fully acknowledging where you are, right? Right. At the same time, it's never really going through that whole process. It's, I'm going to ignore everything that's ever happened to me and I'm going to pretend that this happened instead, that I'm in this place. But you can't really get to the freedom that you talk about, the relationship that you're talking about, and the community and solidarity with your body, if you're pretending that everything that ever happened that led you to this place never really happened, or you don't work on processing it in any real way. I mean, then every time that you go to the doctor and they say something to you, what do you do then? You know, how do you then not let that impact you? It's almost kind of like like I think of like glass, right? Like a piece of glass, and like you throw a little pebble at it and then you throw another little pebble at it and you keep throwing pebbles at it, and it like starts to weaken it, and then over time, you get one small pebble and it shatters the glass. And it's like, if you don't do what you need to do for each time a pebble hits you to repair the glass a little bit each time to make it stronger and more resilient, and all you're doing is saying, I'm just gonna pretend the pebble never happened. Eventually the glass is gonna shatter. And that just sounds like, talk about turning away from yourself rather than meeting yourself. And I know that this work, as uncomfortable as it is, it's all about meeting yourself.
Yeah, yeah, I love that analogy with the glass. Yeah. And I think also, for a lot of folks, there's something in the integration of all of the broken, that we can be whole and amongst our brokenness, if you like. Certainly in chronic illness communities and
Oh yeah.
in disability communities and in fact community, it's kind of stepping off that ladder altogether and kind of turning and looking at ourselves differently. Sonia Renee Taylor talks about the ladder of body hierarchies, and sometimes when we're doing this work and body acceptance work or body image work, personal healing practices can be really powerful and important. And sometimes if we're not kind of also looking at what happened to us or where did this come from, and starting to notice it and actually practicing stepping off the ladder altogether, which is really hard work to do. We're not actually creating a world that all of us get safety and belonging in. And even those of us who feel most broken can somehow find a way to be whole, so I love, there's something about, for me, like I can't undo some of the breakages. And so how do I still kind of, meet myself, like you said, and just rewrite a story or a narrative that includes all of that in a way that doesn't require me to erase it or to kind of get back or to somehow overcome. That's so much of what I felt. And yeah, you're right. It's not even about, it doesn't include us here in our present moment. It doesn't include the wisdom of the ways we've tried to cope. It doesn't include the wisdom of how we've tried to survive. And it doesn't rebuild that trust in ourselves and, in our body, whatever trust means. That might not be a word that resonates for everyone, but yeah.
No, I was thinking about how you said that it's not about repairing the pieces, but allowing the pieces to kind of be, the broken pieces to be part of what makes it beautiful in the end, like what makes you beautiful and what makes you your own unique person, and being able to rewrite your own body story. And like you said, meet your body and embody it. And know that you're whole and fine, even though, like, whole and safe and all of the things for yourself, and enough. I was thinking of like a kaleidoscope. too about how, I have this piece of artwork, and I'll share it in the show notes and on our thing, but there's this artwork that I'm not going to quote it perfectly, but it's like, I'm a kaleidoscope. I'm a million broken pieces. And someone told me that they thought that my broken pieces were beautiful, and that they made me who I was. And I think that is in a lot of ways true for this journey, right? Like you said, you can't ignore the things that happened and not and continue to happen. Right? Like, I also want to acknowledge that too, when you're working through this and you are in a fat body, and you are going to continue to be met with this doesn't go away. It's not like all of a sudden, because you've done this work to accept yourself, that everyone else has already accepted you too. That's not what happens, and it's so fucked up. But that's part of, I think, the reality. And I think the more that we can go back and say, that's not my fault, and I think the more that we can do that work, the more we can understand that that's their shame, and it doesn't have to be mine to carry all the time.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes
absolutely.
sense.
No, it makes so much sense. I think naming that we're going to continue to experience these breakages as well. There's something about, part of body story work is not just sort of bringing our awareness to what have been our lived experiences, in this body, what's enhanced and disrupted my experiences, but also like, what are the roots? What are the roots of that? Really going back and naming capitalism, naming patriarchy, naming, colonization, naming white supremacy culture, naming diet culture, naming anti-fatness, naming ableism, naming healthism, naming anti-Black, naming it all. And also exploring alternative approaches and alternative ways of thinking. I think this is where, like, the work of fat activism, the work of disability justice, the work of Black feminists, the work of other communities can be a real place that we can turn to get to do some of that unlearning and reimagining something different. Because if all that we're feeling being offered is just kind of building our resilience within the existing system, that doesn't feel like enough, and if we're just adding to that a kind of resistance, which is super important, like figuring out where we can find communities of solidarity, how we can advocate for ourselves, where does that feel accessible, where does it feel possible to create boundaries, which are not always safe to do, but also where are the kind of stories that we can get immersed in, the kind of podcasts, the people, the thinkers we can follow that help us reimagine something different as well, so that it's not even that we're broken. And I love the kaleidoscope. That's a really beautiful image for me too. But it's also even like, totally flips the narrative completely, that it's not even a kaleidoscope, it's it's a constellation or whatever, that completely flips the narrative for us. I don't know if that's too out there, but that's definitely something that I also think about is how do we reimagine something different? Because I think often it's really hard to do that work, to imagine if we woke up tomorrow in a world where your body was totally affirmed and supported and desired, and you got access to all the healthcare you needed. And this is a question that Hilary Canavy offered to me in body trust training. Why would you want to care for yourself? And often people we can't even imagine that as possible. So like where are the places that we can go to where people are already imagining like what it would be like if everyone felt safe in their body, and if everyone had dignity and belonging, like what would that look like?
I think you have to attach to that bigger picture, right? Because I know for myself, my daughters are a huge source of inspiration for me, for why I want to have these I believe to be incredibly important conversations, because I don't want them, their children, their children's children, and going back and forth to, if there could be a day when people did inherently just have dignity and they could access medical support without there being any kind of weight stigma associated with it or any kind of thing like that, and they were able to be met as a human, as a person, right? And not this thing that had to be fixed and that something was inherently wrong with them. Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't deserve that? Who doesn't think that that's the way that the world should be moving towards? And the fact that we're not already there is appalling to me. But you're right, you named all of the reasons why. I mean, colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, all healthism, all of those pieces that you mentioned are the reasons why we're not there. And the more we spend our time learning more about how those structures came into place and what we can do to disrupt those structures for ourselves and also for future generations is, I believe, to be some of the most important work. And it starts with each person diving into rewriting their own body story. It starts with there, because the more that you understand around what happened to you, why it happened to you, and why it's continuing to happen to you, the more we can do this work so that other people don't ever have to experience it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's Sonia Renee Taylor, like I think I read it or heard it in a podcast, I'll get mixed up, saying, the way we dismantle the ladder in the world is to dismantle the ladder within ourselves, so this, I think we can only start where we are. And I think also the invitation is to move towards the edges of our own body acceptance, so to absolutely center our own experiences and our healing. So it's not to invalidate, that's why body stories are important, really getting to have space for our experiences and to name where we were harmed. And then also the piece of also looking at where we are also both complicit still, and where we are, where yes, we can name our suffering, but also where we can name where we've been protected by, some of our, like as a white person, naming, where I've struggled as, fat person, as a neurodivergent person, and also like situating myself in a bigger commitment, like you said, is kind of part of it. In body trust, it's named as making this healing bigger than you. And I think that that's really the invitation in this work, rooting ourselves in solidarity with others.
I love that. I feel like we could talk about this all day long and and kind of go deeper into it. And I'd love to have you back and talk about this even more, because I feel like there's so many areas that we didn't even really get to fully touch on. But I will mention real quick, I'll put in the show notes too, you mentioned briefly Body Trust Provider, and that's Hillary and Dana's work. And they have a book, Reclaiming Body Trust. I'll put that in the show notes for everybody too. Hillary and Dana did come on the podcast, which was wonderful, and talking to them about their reclaiming body trust and everything. But I would love for you to share with us where people can find you, what kind of work you're doing, what it looks like to work with you on rewriting their body stories, and maybe how they can start at home.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for having me on. I really love this conversation. So I'm not the most active person online.
Neither am
I. I do have an Instagram account, but I haven't posted there in a while. But you can follow me on there at Nicola Haggett. I also have a website with nicolahaggett.com, and on there you can sign up for my mailing list, which is very sporadic, but I do send something there when I'm got something new that I'm offering. And that's probably the best way to contact me, also via Instagram, actually, by sending a message if you're interested in working with me. There's a link in there to book in a call. I don't have a huge practice at the moment because I'm doing my master's in Gestalt therapy, and so I'm kind of in a in-between space where I'm having to manage my placements for that, alongside, you know, the body liberation work that I do. But yeah, if you want to reach out there are a couple of different ways to work with me, but usually we start at around 8 sessions, and there's some sliding scale spots available. Those are full at the moment, but you can always contact me and get added to a waiting list. But yeah, there's more to come. I will be evolving my practice, so you know, in the next year or so. But that's the best way to get in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicola, for coming on and sharing all about disrupting body shame. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Hey friends, it's Dana, and thanks for listening to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your family and friends, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and if you can, we would absolutely love it if you left a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps spread the word so more people can find the show and learn how to break out of diet culture, the body image spiral, and find a more peaceful relationship with food in their bodies with wholehearted eating. If you're interested in learning more about how you can work with me or Christina for one-on-one nutrition counseling or checking out our self-paced courses, head over to wholeheartedeating.com, and we'll see you again here next week.